We have a long agenda tonight. We have an update of Summit Carbon Solutions in all of our states. We have an update what we might expect from Summit in Nebraska. We have a map that might show us a few things. We also have a reminder of what you do with trespassing and no trespassing in Nebraska from Tom. And then we have some legislation items that we want to talk about that is being worked on between Nebraska, Iowa. We know about South Dakota and their ban on eminent domain that started last summer. And then we also have next steps, what we might be doing to make sure that everybody's aware in the state about what might happen with Summit and what they might be doing. Um, with Summit, they have tried to change up their plan and trying to do a compensation for counties and landowners, um, which isn't really a compensation. It's pennies on the dollar. So we can discuss that as well if you have questions, but we're trying to be proactive and make sure people are aware that it's still a forever easement and it's still dangerous and it doesn't matter how much money they pay you. It's still detrimental to your farm, to your land, to your generations to come. Um, so we'll just wait a few more minutes here and then we'll get started. And we'll begin with the introductions of our panelists. So I'll just give it another minute.
Should we have folks introduce themselves in the chat?
We can do that. That's a good idea. So if you can introduce yourself in the chat and just say your name, the state, county that you're from. I know that we do have invited Iowa people. We've invited South Dakota people. So went out to many different areas. So if you want to provide that information, that would be great. We do have a lot of support from our Iowa partners in this. They've been very helpful in coordinating with us. Some of our letter writing that we've done to our Nebraska partners because they are been impacted by the IUC permit process and how they've struggled with that in Iowa. So it's very important to know that we're not alone in this in Nebraska in case something does change drastically for our state.
One other quick thing is I see everybody sending their comments to the host and panelists in the chat, but I don't think everybody gets to see that. So if you're using the chat where you see it says two and it says host and panelists, scroll down and click everyone. That way we can share with the entire group here our messages. Otherwise, it's just our eyes seeing it.
Great point. All right, well, it is 5 after, so let's get started and Emma can continue to let people in. I want to introduce our panelists today. It's very important to know that these people are very dedicated to fighting the carbon pipeline fight. Not a lot of knowledge here, a lot of background, a lot of history. I'll start with Emma Schmit. She's organizing director for BOLD. She's worked across multiple states to coordinate and support organizers fighting the proposed build out of CO2 pipelines and with our Pipeline Fighters Hub. And if you don't have the link to that, we will get you that. And the easement action teams. And she's a lifelong rural Iowan based in Calhoun County. And she worked for Food and Water Watch after college. And she also helped with the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is the oil pipeline that went through almost completely of Iowa. So she helped fight with that. So she is now with us and she's helping us with all the different states that are involved, which includes states that aren't on the Summit Pipeline, which is like Texas, Indiana, Illinois. So she's helping with those states as well. So it's not just the Summit Carbon Pipeline path of, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Nebraska, Iowa. It's with all these other places as well, being hit up with all these other pipeline situations going on. Then we have Paul Blackburn. He's the attorney and energy policy advisor for BOLD. He provides legal services on pipeline and renewable energy matters, and he has worked on crude oil pipeline issues since 2008 and also has experience in renewable energy policy and development. he represented nonprofit clients in South Dakota, the Public Utility Commission hearings, and the KXL pipeline, and the Minnesota PUC hearing on the expansion of Line 67, which is part of the Enbridge pipeline. He began his legal career in DC, so don't count that against him, at the law firm at Venice Feldman. But after leaving private practice, he began his career with the nonprofit sector, and we were glad to have him with Bold helping us with these fights and with his knowledge of all that knowledge that he's gained. And then, of course, we have Tom Genung. He is a landowner organizer, basically for Bold, Nebraska. He's been with us since 2009. And he has been a part of this when he was involved with the KXL pipeline when it was going to cross his family property, kind of like how I started with Bold. When you have somebody giving you a letter saying, we're going to split your farm in half and we're going to take it from you. So that's how he got involved as well, way back when. He works with tribal representatives and organizations along with allied groups, and continues to be our resource to help organize landowners and advocates to become engaged in stopping these pipelines. So he has a lot of knowledge going back to 2009, starting with Bold with Jane Clubb, and just an overall knowledgeable person for Nebraska. So he has a lot of that knowledge to bring to us. So with that, I want to start with Emma, who can bring forth what are the updates with Summit in the other states? What has happened in Iowa with the IUC and the amendments? What happened recently with what they're trying to claim as their new strategy, things like that?
All right, I am going to share my screen here just for a quick, pretty little presentation. But I am going to warn you, I probably should have written a script for this because I like to just yap, and I might go a little off the rails here. So we're going to have a fun time. All right, but start off with, for folks that are not aware, this is what the full Summit route as originally proposed looks like. So it's going, a lot of plants in Iowa, South Dakota, a few in Nebraska, and then it's all heading up towards North Dakota. I forgot about Minnesota. Minnesota exists too. But it's about 2,500,000, not 2,500,000, 2,500 miles of pipeline that is being proposed by Summit. Whether or not this is the route that is going to be proposed in the near future, who knows? Because of a lot of the developments that we've been able to succeed in the past few months and years, really. But this is what right now, currently, as things stand, the route is supposed to look like. So let's start at the top, talk about what's going on in North Dakota. So first things first, do want to clarify this map just a little bit. You'll see this section like right here. This is totally hypothetical because their original intent, Summit's original intent, was to connect to a yet to be built nitrogen plant up here, but it again has yet to be built, and so they don't have a permit in North Dakota for this section. Everything else, the rest of this pipeline route, they have been permitted to build. They got that permit back in November of 2024, but that permit has been appealed, and the appeal process it takes a long time. So we are now in kind of just the beginning stages. So last month, the Public Service Commission, the North Dakota PSC, which is kind of the oversight body for this project in North Dakota, they finally got the transcripts from all the hearings and everything finalized. And so now that that is done, we're able to move on to briefs. And so we just got a briefing schedule. And I want to say we have briefs due like mid-January. And that's kind of the first step in the appeal process. We'll, both sides will write out arguments about, why we believe we're right, why we believe they're wrong, all that good stuff. And after that, potentially there'll be oral arguments and then a ruling from the judge. And then, of course, if somebody doesn't like that ruling, there's a possibility of appeal. But that's still quite a ways off, right? We're still, like I said, just focusing on the briefs right now. So that'll be coming. Keep your eyes peeled. I'm sure there'll be lots of good information coming out of those briefs. But then we not only have the pipeline permit in North Dakota that we have to worry about, but there's this sequestration aspect of things. So in December 2024, the North Dakota Industrial Commission approved the permits for the injection of CO2. And you can't see the third pin here, but there's three little spots, and those are the sequestration areas in North Dakota. Again, we're not just like taking that line down. And in fact, we just got a really good ruling out of the North Dakota courts. Was that last week? Maybe 2 weeks ago. It feels like everything's always happening all at once, right? But that ruling, and I'm sure Paul could explain this much better, but I'm going to give you the dumbed down version as I understand it. Basically, North Dakota has a law that if 60% of landowners agree, then they can inject carbon underneath your ground. Like those other 40%, kind of too bad, so sad. Like, we'll give you some sort of compensation, not necessarily just compensation. We'll give you equitable compensation. Um, but that's the rules. Well, turns out those rules aren't very constitutional, according to the courts. They have declared that because this law did not allow for just compensation as decided by a jury trial, which is in North Dakota state constitution, the law was unconstitutional. So that is a major win for us. Now that doesn't mean that that's going to be like the final ruling. There's still time for Summit to appeal that ruling if they wanted to. And there's also the chance that, the next North Dakota legislative session, they just go in and change the law. There's all sorts of different options available, but at this point in time, at least, major win, and we are going to ride that high because North Dakota is, as I'm sure most people know, a very welcoming state to not only just pipelines in general, but especially carbon pipelines. So the fact that we got even this kind of win is pretty major for the state of North Dakota. So keep your eyes on North Dakota because lots still to come. But if we head down south, if I can get to the next screen. Awesome. All right. Let's talk about South Dakota because boy, they are kind of the shining star in a lot of our work with Summit, right? They have just killed it every step of the way. So back in 2023 was the first time, highlight on the word first time the South Dakota Public Utilities Commission denied Summit's pipeline application. Shot it down. But then in 2024, Summit came back, unfortunately, but their permit wasn't really much better. They added a couple like 100 miles to their pipeline route, so they expanded it in South Dakota. So now it's like proposed 600 and some odd miles. But then in mid 2025, the PUC came back and again denied Summit. They said, nope, this is not viable. Back to the drawing board. And Summit has not appealed that decision. They have not submitted a new application. So they're kind of dead in the water when it comes to South Dakota. And that is in large part because the legislature back last session banned eminent domain for carbon pipelines, which is, I cannot describe to you how much effort and just dedication that took from people on the ground in South Dakota to make that law happen. I mean, a lot of it started when a really bad law was passed in South Dakota that took away local control and just was so anti-property rights and anti-landowner, but it passed their state legislature. And it also ticked people off and it got people motivated. And they were able to collect over 30,000 signatures from everyday South Dakotans from across the state and get that law put on the ballot. So the people of North Dakota, no, the people of South Dakota got to vote on it. And when they did, when the people of South Dakota got to see this law and decide whether or not they wanted it on their books, they voted it down. So that law that was totally just anti everything that, is constitutional and right was kicked out. And at the same time, they also were able to elect a whole bunch of new people to their state legislature, people that actually represented the people that did not support Summit, and they were able to pass this ban on eminent domain for CO2 pipelines. So South Dakota, just killing it. But where things stand right now, kind of murky. There's not a lot happening. Summit doesn't seem to be really exploring South Dakota anymore at this point. They have said in a few times that, well, we could still get through South Dakota. We have a couple easements on the main line. We could, if we don't use any of these laterals like that I'm circling on the map, those, we could still get through South Dakota. Whether or not you buy that is up to you. But what it seems like is that they're not really looking too hard at South Dakota at the moment. That could change. So people in South Dakota obviously still need to, keep their eyes and ears open. But it does seem like they've at least for now stopped Summit there. If we keep going, head over to Minnesota. Not a lot happening in Minnesota. They did, at least at this point in time, it's kind of interesting, but they did back in 2024, right around the same time that North Dakota approved Summit's pipeline permit, Minnesota approved Summit's pipeline permit, but not for the whole pipeline. So you see, like, this is the big section of pipeline. They haven't even submitted an application for that part. So they are still at like square zero, right? When it comes to the main line in Minnesota. But they did get a permit for this tiny little section up here that goes into North Dakota. I think it's, do not quote me on this, but I think it's like 28 miles. So it's not a very long section of pipeline. And even then, on like when they were getting in the approval process at that point in time, they still had 7 landowners that were holding out and refusing to let Summit have an easement, which is a pretty big deal because Minnesota, kind of like South Dakota now, does not expressly grant the right to eminent domain. They haven't outright banned it like South Dakota, but they do not expressly grant the right to eminent domain for carbon pipelines, which leaves things kind of up in the air. But we haven't really seen a lot from Summit out of Minnesota since that application was approved. So kind of just waiting and seeing. We have heard rumors that Minnesota's totally off the table. I kind of doubt that, but we'll see. And then if we head south to Iowa, long screen. Lots to say about Iowa because there's a lot of pipeline proposed for Iowa. So Iowa has the bulk of the proposed pipeline. There's around over 1,100 miles of pipeline proposed for Iowa, and it's actually in 2 phases. So Summit first applied in 2021 for 688 miles of pipeline through Iowa. They were granted approval with conditions for that pipeline route in 2024. We have, of course, appealed that permit, and that appeal is ongoing. It gets kind of confusing, so I'm going to try and give like the rough rundown, but essentially, we submitted our briefs just like we're doing here in North Dakota very shortly. Submitted our briefs that like talk about our arguments and like why we think this permit should not have been granted. And then Summit came along and filed a request for remand so that the application or the permit could go back to the Iowa Utilities Commission, which we're waiting on a ruling from the judge to see if it will actually be remanded back to the Iowa Utilities Commission or if we can continue with using the court systems to get an answer to all of our questions and all of that. So we're kind of in a waiting game, but we think we'll probably get an answer here shortly. But that's only phase one, right? At the same time that we were waiting on approval of the phase one permit, Summit came along and introduced phase two, which is an additional 300 and some odd miles of pipeline proposed for Iowa. That permitting process is ongoing. And in fact, Summit is now attempting to, and this is why they asked for remand, because they're attempting to consolidate both the docket for the pipeline permit that has been approved with all of the dockets for these 300 miles of pipeline that have not been approved, that we have not had hearings for, that no due process has occurred with. And they're trying to consolidate that all into one, which is just bonkers in my opinion. And it's made things kind of confusing because we really haven't seen that before. So lots of interesting things going on in the legal realm and in the administrative process in Iowa, but hopefully we'll get things sorted out and get some answers in the next handful of months. Iowa also, of course, has been a key area where we've been working on county ordinances. I don't know how many county ordinances we're up to in the state. I knew on Sunday, I wrote it down and then I forgot. So I know it's over a dozen, I want to say. But so lots of county ordinances that have, just enacted protections for communities. They've included things like requiring notification and certain setbacks and all sorts of things that are a benefit to communities and just put some sort of oversight on these pipeline companies. But of course, when the first 2 counties passed their ordinances, Summit came along and they did what Summit did and they sued the counties. Now, the counties have been amazing and they have fought this through the courts every step of the way. We went all the way to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. And unfortunately, they had a ruling that we didn't totally love. And so the counties are now in the process of appealing that ruling all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But it's not super easy to get a case heard by the Supreme Court, right? So I think it's like 1% of cases that are put forward as to the Supreme Court actually get chosen to be heard. So it's pretty hard to actually have your case heard. But we do have some things on our side. So like certain things like the fact that the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals ruling that, they ruled in our case is a split decision from a 2010 ruling by the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals, We also have the fact that there's been, I think, 55 counties, 7 states, 4 law professors, the Iowa Farm Bureau, I can't even remember who else, who have submitted briefs in support of the Supreme Court taking this case. So we've got a lot of support. We've got, a split decision. There's things that kind of up our odds of being heard, but I wouldn't say that we have like a certain chance of being heard by the Supreme Court. That would be pretty wild, but we expect we'll probably get an answer on whether or not the Supreme Court will take it sometime around January. That is purely a guess, so do not hold me to that. But that's kind of what we're guessing. So we'll see. In that case, will be pretty monumental because, we deserve, our counties deserve to have local control. We know the land best, we know the area best, we know what's best for the people. So the idea that we should allow, people off in DC or even Des Moines to make decisions for us, about us, without us is insane. And on that note, speaking of insanity, um, in Iowa, we also passed a bill through the state house and the state senate last session earlier this year, and it would have, enacted plenty of property rights protections. It would have regulated some certain things within the pipeline company's interests, but they didn't like it. And because the pipeline companies didn't like it, neither did Governor Reynolds, and she ended up vetoing our bill, which, normal people might have just gotten downtrodden and felt kind of like giving up, but not Iowans because we're a little insane, I think, but also in the good way, because I think it just fired up and, fired us up, and we have just this righteous anger going into the next legislative session and demand that we are going to get an even better bill passed this session. And I think it's going to happen, but it means we've got to have everybody helping and everybody doing their part to protect their land and our state. So we'll see what happens this session, but hopefully we'll see legislation coming out of Iowa just like we did South Dakota, and maybe we'll even get some out of Nebraska. Who knows? But speaking of Nebraska, I'm kind of jumping into Paul's section here a little bit, but I did just want to show this map really quickly. These are the signed easements in Nebraska that we've seen. So all these red little flecks, those are signed easements. You can kind of see the green line underneath, which probably seems like, oh boy, a lot of people have signed. I wouldn't look at it that way. In my just personal opinion, just from what I've experienced, you can win a pipeline fight with like probably 25% of landowners opposing. And I don't know if this is 25% that we see that aren't, covered in red. Maybe pretty close. But if we go to the next slide, before I do that, actually, though, I should explain. This little section down here, this was Summit's original route where they got easements, but it seems like they've abandoned it. So they still have these easements here that they could use, but it doesn't appear as if that's the route they're going with. So just to clarify that. But like I was saying, I think you need about 25% of people opposing a pipeline to have a decent chance of making change, right? Well, if we look at a proposed route, this is just my guess of what a route could look like, because now Summit is saying that they're not going to North Dakota. They're talking about going to Wyoming. Well, we have all this section of pipeline. Obviously, this is not, exactly what their route would look like, but it's a guesstimate. I would assume we're pretty close on the counties that would be impacted at least. That's certainly more than 25%. So if we can talk to all these people along this red line and make sure that they're aware and know the things that the people that signed easements back in 2022 or 2023 that they didn't know about, all of the things that have just come to light in recent years, if we can make sure that these people in the red line know about it, I think there's a good chance that they're probably not going to sign easements. We stand a good chance of fighting Summit off in Nebraska. But it's going to take a lot of work, and I hope everybody here is willing to put in that work, because I can't do it, Shelli can't do it, Tom can't do it, Paul can't do it, but we can all do it together. So that's my spiel. Shelli, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Emma. There's a lot going on with that, and we do have all that information we've been gathering for years. And those easements that were signed in Nebraska were from mainly 22 and 23, some in 21. So that's before anybody knew what Summit was. And as you know, nobody knew really what it was. They thought it was a utility, and it's not. So we want to further discuss with the Summit and what to expect in Nebraska, as far as what to expect and what happens in Nebraska, because we have different rules in Nebraska. We don't have an IUC, an IU utility board kind of committee that handles these things. So if Paul could come on and explain, what's the difference there and the possibility of that map and what the expectations might be and how people need to make sure that they're up to speed with, either domino law or with bold to make sure that they understand what's happening if they do get approached in the upcoming months. And maybe they won't, but we just don't know what they're going to do. So Paul, can you answer some of those questions?
Sure. Thanks, Shelli. Let me just take a step back and say, you know, Summit said they've invested about $1 billion in their project so far, and that's a lot of money. And at the same time, it's kind of, is it water under the bridge and they should just give it up? It's the sunk cost fallacy, or should they keep going? Our understanding is they're trying to keep going because they're filing in Iowa. They're starting to do additional land work in Iowa. And so they seem to keep moving. At the same time, they've already spent a lot of investor cash, and investors don't like to have their cash spent without, some route to profitability. It's not clear that they have a route to profitability yet. So that means that Summit is probably fairly cost conscious at this point too, that they're not going to be flinging money or throwing money around with wild abandon because their investors, may be willing to keep going, but that doesn't mean they're going to be willing to keep throwing money in large amounts at this project. The other thing is, of course, it's possible that an action in another state will further cripple the project and make it unlikely to be built. And we can't know that, that's possible. I'm not saying it's likely to happen. But for example, if the legislation passes in Iowa that would ban the use of eminent domain for CO2 pipelines in Iowa, as they did in South Dakota, that would probably take out so much of the project that it wouldn't be viable anymore and it would just disintegrate. So, the Iowa legislative process could have an effect on Summit's future. In terms of going to North Dakota, the other implication of this lawsuit that was just won was that the court said that the sequestration, the amalgamation of pore space and taking pore space was a takings under North Dakota law. And that's significant because the North Dakota Constitution limits takings in North Dakota for private entities to public utilities or common carriers. And Summit's not a public utility. And as we've argued at the courts in Iowa, it's also not a common carrier. So, there's a certain doubts about whether it can keep moving ahead in North Dakota anyway. And taking out all those plants in South Dakota, because unless they change the law in South Dakota, which would be a heavy lift and difficult to do in the state, Summit's project, about half their ethanol plants were removed from the project deal. When they're doing these projects and figuring out what all the contracts are going to be, they want to know who all the potential players are, all the potential interested parties. And if you remove roughly half of the ethanol plants from the deal, that means that the remaining ethanol plants have to put a higher amount of operating costs, and their profitability for their amount of revenue and income from it goes down. And so does the income for all the other investors too, all the investors. So, once you have such a major hatchet job on basically the thing got chopped in half, someone has to rework all of its contracts probably to make this all work. And if they go through Nebraska, which they've said in Iowa, meetings that they're planning to go to Nebraska or Colorado, that means re-engineering the project. It means doing new cost estimates. It means, figuring out new easements that they're going to have to go for. Basically doing an entirely new pipeline across the state of Nebraska. And that takes a long time to do, and it requires a lot of money to do that kind of work as well. So, just to say that the fact that they're still not coming out with a clear route of what they want is perhaps not surprising, because they wouldn't have started that until sometime in maybe the spring or middle of the summer, even late summer, to figure that out. And to do all the engineering for a cross Nebraska route, to do all the, get investor commitments, figure out the cost of it, do all the cost estimating, get investor commitments and all those sorts of things. It just takes time to work out. And then to go back to their ethanol partners and figure out, what the deal is going to be. They've got, dozens and dozens of very complex contracts to work through with the lawyers, investors. It's not a simple thing at all to do. So that it appears they didn't get that all done by November when they started having their open houses in Iowa. And they may, it seems like they're working on it. So they'll probably get it done at some point here. Then they'll announce in Nebraska and they'll come out and start doing things. And then the question is what route they're going to take. And it seems like sort of like Emma's map that they're going to dive south of Sandhills and maybe not everyone in this webinar understands the importance of the Sandhills, but the Sandhills was one of the main sticking points with regard to the Keystone XL pipeline, because building pipelines through the Sandhills is deeply, deeply problematic for the land. It's just so highly erosive that putting pipelines through the Sandhills is really a bad idea from all the ranchers' point of view and from an environmental point of view. And so TransCanada was forced to mostly sort of go around the Sandhills. And it seems pretty clear that Summit would have to do that too. So that's why in the map that Emma showed, there was the Sandhills area outlined, and they would dodge below that. They may also try to stay just north of the Platte River and go along the Platte River because it's going to be relatively flat along the Platte. And the more river crossings they have, the more they have to do directional drills to get under the river. So they may just go along just above the northern part of the river, not necessarily parallel exactly, but they may stay on the northern side and sort of tuck between the Sandhills and the Platte. And that's quite possibly what they're going to do. But they could also, if they're going to go to Nebraska, they're going to want to get new ethanol contracts. And understanding is that Tallgrass and this Trailblazer project has been busy trying to scoop up ethanol plants in Nebraska. That could have an effect on Summit, because if Summit can't get new ethanol partners in Nebraska, then it has a long way to go across Nebraska without adding any additional revenue. And Tallgrass might have a commercial advantage over Summit because Tallgrass is using the existing Trailblazer pipeline. So they don't have a huge capital cost of having to build a whole lot of new pipelines. They have to build laterals and do some other things, but it's I don't remember exact cost estimates for a Trailblazer, but I imagine it's billions less than Summit. And that means that in theory, Tallgrass could give a better commercial deal to ethanol plants than Summit could. Summit may also try to go down to Kansas and pick up some of the ethanol plants in Kansas, and Tallgrass may be doing that as well. And again, if the ethanol plants are playing off these companies against each other, then we'll see what comes of that. But again, it would take a while for the ethanol board of directors to look at the deals offered to them, to make a decision on that, then to work out the contracts and see if they can get a final contract. There's just a lot goes into these kinds of big projects, just a lot. And and then Summit would also need to get sequestration sites lined up, potentially enhanced oil recovery operators lined up in Nebraska. It's a whole other set of deals that have to be worked out. In some ways, the original Summit project was relatively simple in the commercial sense because they gave all the original ethanol phase one plants the same deal. They all went to the same sequestration site up in North Dakota that was at. With a new deal, they're going to Wyoming and they may have more than one sequestration site. Then, going to have different ethanol plants coming in at different times and different deals potentially, or maybe they're going to rework the whole deal, or they may go to enhanced oil recovery in either Colorado or Wyoming. So, quite a bit more complicated if they go this way. But I would expect that if they can pull this off, which is still an if, that they might get the land agents out in Nebraska sometime in the new year. Perhaps as early as January, but maybe not until February or March. We'll just have to see how industrious their attorneys and CPAs and everybody else are that works on these deals. and how fast, how much money what the burn rate they're willing to do for their investor funding. Because there's the old engineering rule: fast, cheap, and good. Pick two. If they do this fast and cheap, it won't be a good deal. If they do it fast and good, it won't be cheap. So they're more likely to do it cheap and good. Try to do it cheap and good, and that means slow. So so we'll see what they can pull off. Um, and are there other things that you want me to cover, Shelli?
No, I think that covers it. I mean, you pointed out the different aspects of what they think their different options are, and it's still highly skeptical about what they're trying to do. And you kind of laid out a time frame, and that kind of helps us understand that how much time it takes to do this kind of engineering. And that's the biggest problem is like you can't have a design of a whole nother route in a matter of a day or two. It takes a while to do that. One of the open houses that they had in Iowa, one of the landowners also has ground in Nebraska, and she did ask the question, where's the map for Nebraska? I have land in Nebraska if you're going to Nebraska. And the person from Summit said, we don't have that all finished designed out yet, kind of thing. So, who knows how long it's going to take. So
yeah. And from a regulatory point of view in Nebraska, there is no state hearing, no state permitting for carbon dioxide pipelines, as there is in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Iowa, and Minnesota.
So it's by county.
Yeah, that's going to be that was actually a problem for TransCanada too. And in response to the TransCanada application, South Dakota did create a routing law, but only for oil pipelines. And it remains to be seen whether someone's going to try to get that law applied to carbon dioxide pipelines, or whether they're going to do one, or they're going to resist it. But I think that Nebraskans will probably feel that they should have due process rights with regard to this pipeline, as landowners do for oil pipelines. And if Summit agrees, which is not certain because it would take time, then they'd have to get legislation through and get it signed by the governor, and then figure out what agency is going to do that and how it's going to work, and the agency has to probably do its regulations and figure it all out. And Tom, do you have to know when the legislative session is in Nebraska this year, or roughly when it's likely to be from until?
You're on mute, Tom.
Yeah, Shelli's on top of this too, but I think it starts around the 7th of January.
Yes.
Yeah. And so that means that if that's going to happen, and then when the session ends?
It's a shorter one, so it's like 60 days.
Okay.
Yep.
And so that means that they've got a fairly narrow window to try to push something through. And if they don't push something through, then they're trying to just shove this through the county level. And then in theory, that means the counties can pass ordinances and permit themselves, assuming that they have land use authority, which not all counties do in Nebraska. So that's another factor that Summit would probably be one of the earliest things they'd probably do, is run around like they always do and talk to county commissioners and try to get them on board early and try to avoid having county ordinances be put in place. But I think that Nebraskans should be ready for a legislative fight and/or county level advocacy if they want to try to deal with this pipeline. And even though landowners can get some benefits by negotiating easements, as Brian says, it's the non-financial terms that are the most important terms of easements. The money is important, but making sure that you're treated well through the easement terms is really important. And it can take time to do that if landowners are well educated about what they want. But easements only go so far, and as landowners in other states learn, permits if a pipeline is permitted, there's a good chance that a permitting agency will provide benefits to landowners that could be significant, that would be difficult to get with easements. So, if your pipeline is going to go through, which I'm not saying hopefully it won't, but if it does, it's best to have really strong easements and a really strong permit. Hopefully that complement each other so that landowners have the most benefit, both in terms of the way they're treated and the way their land is treated, but also in terms of their financial compensation and limitations on liability and those kinds of issues. So, there's just a lot there that's important to think through. And we'll see how there's going to be likely be a lot of challenges in Nebraska. Once they get to Wyoming, it's different though. Wyoming has a state constitution that grants eminent domain for anything, not only oil and gas pipelines, but anything related to oil and gas production. So my understanding is that if we get to Wyoming, then there's an absolute right for them to use eminent domain for carbon dioxide pipelines. They've already worked out a whole bunch of routes through Wyoming via a federal environmental impact statement process a number of years ago. And Wyoming already has enhanced oil recovery operations and sequestration sites. But, the question is, would someone want to have its own sequestration site again, because that gives them more money than if they go to somebody else? Or, how are they going to tap into existing CO2 pipelines like there's a Denbury/Exxon pipeline from Wyoming up into Montana? There's a lot of open questions there about how they would handle going into Wyoming. They've also said they'd go into Colorado to the DJ oil production basin, and if that's to do sequestration there, that's also possible. So we don't know if it's going to go into Wyoming or branch or go into Colorado, go straight from Nebraska into Colorado and not go to Wyoming, or go to both, or have a branch down to Kansas or go further. It's like, we don't know. And it depends on how much money the investors are going to roll the dice with,
Yep.
and, and as we say, the Navigator pipeline went down. That was probably, I don't know, $500 million in lost investment. Summit's, and the ADM Wolf pipelines, it was withdrawn, applications were withdrawn. Summit is chopped up and they've spent over $1 billion probably on this project so far. And, who's next? So we'll just keep rolling on it and see what happens.
Yep.
But it's going to take a lot of hard work from everybody, and I think people know that. I think people in the Midwest are hardworking folks, and that's the way it is. And if we want to protect our land, if people want to protect their lands and their families, their livestock, their ways of life, and their peace of mind, they're going to have to fight.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. Speaking about how Summit may come into Nebraska, obviously when we first were approached by not only Navigator, but Summit, they came in with their survey crews. And, the biggest questions that we had for Domino Law at that time was, because we're so different from Iowa or South Dakota, what is the situation in Nebraska? And I know Tom has a little experience in how surveys work and how no trespassing laws work. And a couple of years ago, I think it was the first time in my lifetime that we at our family farm put up no trespassing signs. We never felt that we had to do that before, but we did as soon as this happened, because there were strange pickups from Texas, Kansas, all sorts of different states popping up, saying that, they were on public land, they were in the middle of the road and they were doing things, but it just was very highly unusual. So Tom, can you explain a little bit about in Nebraska, what, if I say no, is it no, or do they need some kind of piece of paper to get on your land? It's not like having my great nephew go in and try to go through the creek to look at coyote hunting. It's people trying to, bore holes in your ground and do things like that. So can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yeah, hi, everybody. You want me to chime in here now? Shelli,
Yes.
is that what you had in mind?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, first of all, welcome. I see that there's about a little over 20 people, 25 people on the call. So welcome. I didn't see all of your names, but apparently you have some concerns about easements and pipelines crossing your property. And that's the beginning. If you have a concern about it, then you better get wise too. You better get informed as to what you're dealing with, because you're going to hear some language that goes along with the industry. You're going to hear things that make sense to part of the crowd, but doesn't necessarily make total sense to you. And so that's why, as Shelli talked about there, as soon as the Nebraska legislature, way back in 2014, I may have that not exactly correct, Paul, but legislative bill 1161 was passed, that allowed TransCanada to have access to the eminent domain process here in Nebraska. And I was there at the legislature that day, and my wife, my wife called me on the phone as I was driving back from Lincoln, and said, "Well, what just happened?" And I said, "Well, it was really, really bad, and I'm going to the home place right now and put up no trespassing signs." And so when we talked about getting organized for this call, I said, "Well, what do you want me to kind of cover? I can talk about no trespassing." And that's how it began for us. And Shelli gave a real good example for them on their home place. And I'm not mincing words when I say no trespassing. At least I grew up with my dad being concerned if there was a strange vehicle, and this was many years ago. If there was an unusual vehicle cruising the neighborhood, they might have had good reason to be there. They may have been hunters that had complete an okay from landowners to go out and cruise and see what was going on, but he would be extremely upset. So I kind of come by this a little bit naturally, that I don't want people on my ground whatsoever, and I'm not going to let them on there easily. So I put up the no trespassing signs, and I believe that that's our first line of defense. And if there's people on this call that have already signed easements, feel free to go ahead and put up no trespassing signs anyway, because we don't really know how this is going to end up. And for those that have not signed easements or are concerned about where this new proposed routing might go, let's be aware. Let's put up no trespassing signs, and really mean it. And what do I mean when what am I saying when I say really mean it? First of all, if you have strangers in the neighborhood, feel free to find out what the heck they're doing. Feel free to take a picture of their license plates. Feel free to take a picture of the signage on their vehicles. And certainly not allow them to go on your ground if you don't want them on your ground, because you don't have to do that. You don't have to let them on your ground whatsoever to begin with. Now, later on down the road, they may get a court order or something like that that allows them to come in, but they're going to come in and they're going to be, one of the things I was thinking about is that, most of us out here on the Great Plains and in the Midwest, we're pretty easy to get along with most of the time. And we're pretty much obliged to be friendly. Well, when it comes to these organizations that want an easement and these pipeline companies, they may act like they are very, very friendly, and they try to get on your good side. And all they really want is that easement. And so I think that we need to kind of stick up for ourselves a little bit, and not easily let that happen. They're going to say, "Well, can we just go over there and look around? Can we just walk across your field? Can we walk across that pasture just to see what it's like?" Well, what's the harm in that? Well, the harm in that is that you've opened the gate. So don't open the gate willingly is all I'm saying to that. And then what do you do if you want to take the concern to the higher ups? Well, let me talk about the part that I've recommended to landowners for as long as I've been around this stuff, is you can talk casually to the sheriff's department. You can talk casually to law enforcement. You can talk casually to the receptionist at the sheriff's department and say, well, I think I had some trespassers. That does no good. So if you're serious about this, file a formal complaint. File it so that it's documented, because if down the road, if any of this stuff ends up in court, then there's proof positive that the legal resistance has taken place and legal objection has taken place. So highly recommend that you file a formal complaint. Also, become friendly with your neighbors. Talk to your neighbors. Essentially, these companies don't want people talking to each other, because we start to compare notes, and then pretty soon we find 2 or 3 people that are opposed to it, and then pretty soon, the momentum is there to resist the whole project, and that's what we found with the proposed KXL pipeline. Like Paul or somebody said, well, Emma was talking about maybe 25%. Yeah, there was easements, and there was eminent domain, and there was all that kind of stuff that clouds the issue. But once again, these companies don't want us to be talking to each other, because that tends to allow us to be organized, and we begin to recognize the language, and we know what BS is when we talk about that. Sounds like BS, but we understand it better if we're becoming educated and organized in a way, in opposition to it. And if you're thinking about an easement, like Paul said, it's been taught to us by the Domino Law Group that terms are more important than the price. Terms. And how do you get to the idea of terms within an easement? Well, you don't do that alone, I recommend. You have legal counsel, and I recommend that you have legal counsel that has some knowledge about landowner rights and eminent domain law and those kinds of things. The best ones we know about is the Domino Law Group and Brian Jorday and Paul and folks like that have done this kind of thing before. It is definitely not the attorney that we hired to set up our estate. They may be the best in the West as far as passing that property on to the next generation and all that kind of thing. And that's all good, but the point is that you need legal counsel if you're going to negotiate terms, and also probably negotiating, how much is it going to take money wise or compensation wise. And the other thing that probably needs to go in those is that how long is that easement supposed to last? And that needs to be covered within those kinds of things too.
Okay, thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
And so my final remark is always, if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call at any time. I'm glad to pick up the phone and visit with you.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah,
Paul?
for example, on terms, the 45Q tax credit that's enabling all these, the federal tax credit that's paying your tax dollars that are paying for who pay for all these pipelines, only lasts right now for 12 years. Most pipelines, they keep them in operation for much longer, but what if it only lasts 12 years? Then you've got a pipeline running through your property that's empty and will be there in perpetuity, unless you can get it out of there. Or it's also possible, for example, to fill the pipeline with cement so that it doesn't drain water, so it doesn't sinkholes, it doesn't collapse under heavy equipment. But there's this responsibility for protecting the land from and getting rid of these, mitigating these pipelines after they're used. And that applies to oil and natural gas pipelines too. But there's no law that requires them to remove the pipeline from your property. There's no law that gives you any rights. It's just purely a private agreement. So if you had it terms in your easement that said at the end of 12 years, you're going to pull that pipe out of my property, or you're going to fill it with cement so that it can't collapse and so it can't drain water. Then you can negotiate that as an easement term. If you fail to do that, then what's going to happen is they're going to take the money and run. At the end of the pipeline's life, you can try to get them to do something, but they're just going to say stall until they get away, and investors strip the money out of the project and leave shells there. There's no money to do any mitigation on your land at the end of the whole process. So, those kinds of terms, you might get a nice payment out of the whole thing. But removing in Minnesota, we discovered that removing the 34-inch pipe, which is bigger, but it's not necessarily the size of the pipe, but in Minnesota it was $1,000 a foot. So that means, 5.6 million per mile to remove a pipe. Now for 24-inch pipe, it would be somewhat less, but not a lot less. It'd probably still be, 3 or 4 million at least to remove that pipeline from a mile of ground. That's not something landowners can afford to do. And even filling it with cement, we all know cement is pretty expensive. You're going to put a foundation in or something like that. It's not a cheap proposition. So if the company doesn't set aside money and commit to do that, early on, you're going to be stuck with that pipe forever. And as it rusts and disintegrates, it's going to have a significant impact. In croplands, these pipes, when they're empty, become a little bit buoyant, and they can grant in between air or water, wind or water erosion, and buoyancy. They can start getting close to the surface and interfere with farming. So it's, there's lots of pipes all over the Midwest. They're beginning to come to the surface now, and it turns into a big headache for the landowners who've got those pipes on it. There's a guy in Iowa called me, and he said their solution was just to tell them not to farm that strip over the pipeline anymore. And if they wanted to bring in more dirt, that was going to be the farmer's responsibility, not the company's. So, this eventually it'll happen. Eventually that pipeline will become a problem for you. And it could cost, much more than your easement's values are to get that pipe handled. So just some recommendations, kind of terms of why it's important. Future money too.
Yeah, there was a question in here about the difference between 45Q and 45Z. I know that, this wouldn't even be a project if it wasn't for the tax credits that these private companies were going to get. What can you just briefly explain? We just have a few minutes left. Can you briefly explain the difference between those two, Paul? And then we'll go into next steps.
Yeah, sure. The 45Q tax credit is for carbon capture and sequestration. And the entity that gets the tax credits is whoever owns the capture equipment. So for most of Summit's ethanol partners, Summit would build a capture facility adjacent to the ethanol plant, and Summit would own that capture equipment. And that means that Summit would get the tax credits. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. The ethanol plant could build its own capture facility, then the ethanol plant would own the tax credits. And then Summit would just simply ship the CO2 to someplace. And to already get the tax credit, you have to A, have capture equipment, and B, you have to have a contractual commitment or a contract to dispose of it, either through sequestration or enhanced oil recovery or some other permanent or long-term use. And and those tax credits can be owned by many different entities. You could have a partnership owning the capture equipment. You could have partnerships in combination with corporations and individuals owning the capture facility. So the capture facility could be owned by dozens of entities, and then they'd split the tax credits amongst themselves. They could also sell those over time to each other and shift out ownership and stuff like that. And then they can also transfer those tax credits to either enhanced oil recovery operators or to the sequestration site operators. The permittees for those facilities could get them too. And at present, the tax credit is $85 per metric ton for either sequestration or use in enhanced oil recovery. And since an ethanol plant is typically going to cost, probably is going up in price with all the cost of steel and whatnot these days. But $30 to $40 per metric ton to capture it, but the tax credit is 85. That's still over 100% profit margin. And that's why they're so anxious to try to get these projects done, is because they want to get your tax dollars and get it in their pockets. That's really what they're doing it for. they're not doing it for climate change. They're not doing it, because they care about you or me. They're doing it because they want to get a lot of money, because the profit margins. When Congress set up this 45Q tax credit, they probably didn't even think about what the profit margins would be. They just were told what number to throw into the bill and they threw it in. But it just makes the way they structured it just doesn't make any sense at all. The fixed price tax credit that's so much higher than the cost of ethanol plants. Now the 45Z or tax credit is for clean fuels, and that means that they would get a tax credit for every gallon of, I forget what it is right now, a gallon of clean fuels. It's pretty generous. I forget, it's at $2 a gallon or something, or $1.50, or it's adjustable. Anyway, fair amount of money, but the 45Z tax credit, I believe at this point is limited. They have to get a facility going by 2027. And it has to have, in order to have the low carbon fuel, it has to then have carbon capture with it. But they can't do both at the same time. There's no double dipping. So, one of the things someone was running around saying they could double dip the 45Q tax credit, the ethanol plant get it, that and the 45Z. The law pretty clearly stated the federal law said they can't double dip those. So they have to choose one or the other. And some have backed off on that because they can't lie to their investors about getting that much money. So it's going to be one or the other they're going to do. But practically speaking, the chance of Summit getting any of these ethanol plants up and rolling to 2027 is slim to none. So I'm not sure the 45Z tax credit will be a significant incentive unless Congress extends the deadline, which is always possible with enough lobbying dollars. They could do that, but we'll see. I think the 45Q is still going to be the primary driver, and maybe they'll try to get 45Z, but since they have to do one or the other, they would pick whichever one was going to earn them the most money and do that, whichever one was viable.
Yep. And of course, there's a comment in the chat about, that the easements can be sold to another entity at any time. So, be aware of that. You may be dealing with Summit today, but you may be dealing with ExxonMobil or whoever if they sell those easements to somebody, which is probably the intent. These companies don't, they just keep selling things to make money. That's what they're in. That's what they're in business to do, and that's what corporations are in to do. They're not in this for the landowner. They're in it for themselves and for their shareholders and their investors. So they will sell that easement. It's highly likely, and that's what they do. That's just, and Navigator has sold some to Summit, so that has already happened.
And I would guess down the Gulf Coast, what they're doing is they're having companies, what are called midstream companies. In other words, pipeline specialist operators own the CO2 pipelines. And then they essentially, ship for other companies that are capturing the CO2. And that's the way most of the pipeline systems in the United States work. So, there's the big Enbridge system out of Canada. Enbridge doesn't own the oil, they just ship the oil. There's the DAPL system owned by Enterprise Partners. And again, that's a midstream operator. And those companies are specialized in operating pipelines. And so they really know how to do that well and how to make money at it well and how to deal with all the regulations and everything else. The Summit is really a development entity. And just like people are going to do land development, they're going to get a project going up and going, and then they're very likely to sell it. Cash out and sell it, and they'd sell the pipeline to a midstream operator. And so, the land agents, you're never going to see them again. And you're never going to see, after a while, you probably never see Summit either. It'll go to somebody else, more than likely. So, yeah.
Right. So I know we're a little bit over 7:05 now, and I wanted to go through, we read through the questions and answers in there, answered a few questions. Regarding legislation, I've been watching the Nebraska.gov website, looking for lobbyists that are for these pipeline companies and or ethanol plants and or oil companies. It's very interesting information how the lobbyists are paid a great deal of money to go down to the Capitol. So probably in the near future, we'll be asking for a call day to call your legislatures and tell them that you are concerned about your property rights, that you want to protect them. from pipelines and private companies who want to use eminent domain against your property. This is still supposed to be America, supposedly. So we need to make sure that we're talking to our legislature. They were elected by us, not by those corporations. Corporations are not, they're not in it for you. They're in it to make a profit. So just remember that. And our legislators need to know that as well. And the other note is that we are going to do next steps regarding, social media. We're going to continue to be on social media. We have several different outlets for that, along with a lot of CO2 pipeline Facebook pages that we're all involved in. Emma and Tom, and I and Paul, we all are involved in. I have at least 6 of them, going down from Illinois to North Dakota to Louisiana, Texas. So there's there's a lot of Facebook pages that we can use to get the word out and explain the hazards of the CO2 pipelines. So we will be still doing that. We are planning to still talk to our commissioners and planning and zoning commissioners. In April, I did a 9-county, Tom and I did a 9-county explanation, attended these meetings to explain to them the current status. We'll probably do that again coming shortly in the spring of the year, explaining some of the legislation situations. And also, we just want everybody to keep their eyes and ears open on any strange vehicles, any strange things going on, any land agents that are out there trying to talk to people. Pay attention to your elderly parents, grandparents that own land that they might be approaching. Again, as we come, like Paul said, it may be spring, it may be January, February, but please make sure that if your relatives are in a situation where they are vulnerable, that they're protected. So they're not signing something they just didn't know what they were signing. Also, we'll probably be talking about the legislation and how some of these bills are coming forth so that you're aware of those. So we'll be keeping you updated on those.
And if you hear anything in counties, if you know any county commissioners got any good spies in the counties, they go to the counties early on too.
Yes, they do. They tend, so I guess my biggest beef with the counties is that they're obligated to put the agenda into the local newspaper, which I don't get every single local newspaper in the state, but they also will show on their website the agenda 24 hours in advance. So that doesn't give us much time to make plans to go to these meetings and give our point of view to what's being presented to the commissioners. And again, these companies are good at getting to those commissioners and planning and zoning behind the scenes, off the record, to get on the agenda, and they already have everything said and done. So you got to be very cautious and be in close contact with your commissioners, your supervisors, and your planning and zoning to make sure that they know how you feel, because this is where you live, and the people that are coming in for Summit don't live here. They work for a corporation, and they should care about you and not the company. So Paul made a very good point there. Any other comments from Emma, Paul, or Tom? Emma, will you be providing the slide deck that you provided this evening?
Oh, I suppose I could think about doing such a thing. Yeah, for sure. And we'll send the recording out as well.
Yes, the recording will be sent out. So I appreciate everybody for attending. I know that I had some calls today from people that wanted the recording because they couldn't make it. I know there's a lot going on in December, but I know that it was important for us to at least give an update, since we haven't had one since February, specifically for Nebraska, just to say all that's going on across this whole issue with this pipeline. So we will send out the recording, and you can pass it on to your family and friends as well. So appreciate your time tonight. Thank you very much.